morning. Today is Monday, May 4th, and we're going to start off this week with some notes. And we're going to be talking about China, right? So far in Unit 4, we started off and we spoke about the Mongols who conquered all of Asia. And eventually they also conquered what we call China today, right? But China is a massive country with billions of people and a super long history, right? China, in one way, shape, or another, has existed for 3,000 years. But we're only going to focus on the medieval period, which was actually a really important part of Chinese history because it's going to end up creating the nation of China that we think of today, even though it was very different back in these days. So if you haven't already, please open up your Google Slides so that you can take the notes. You can make a brand new one if you want, or you can just continue from your Mongols notes from before. This is your do now, like if we were still in class, this is what you would have done. I would have asked you to look at this image and tell me 3 things you notice about this man. If you don't know, which you probably don't, right? Why would I assume that? And if you do, wow. This is Emperor Hongwu, who was the first of the Ming Dynasty, which is something we're going to talk about today. We're going to focus on that dynasty because it was the predominant dynasty that ruled over China during the medieval time period. But you don't need to copy any of this down. You can start copying from here on outward. Right, so before I begin with any of these East Asian countries, I'll do the same when we talk about Japan or Korea. I like to give some basic information about a country because we've all heard of China, but a lot of people don't really know much else, right? So basically, what you need to know is that China is in East Asia, and it is the most populated country in the world with 1.3 billion people, right? For you to kind of imagine that, the population of the United States is 330 million. So that's more than 4 times as many people that live in the United States are Chinese. 1 out of every 5 people on the planet lives in China, right? So maybe that helps you kind of understand this is a massive amount of people. And it is a huge country. It is the 2nd largest or 3rd largest, depending on whether you want to count bodies of water or not. Country in the world. Only Russia is bigger than China. And some people argue that the United States is bigger or China is bigger. Basically, the US and China are really close to about the same size in territory as one another. But obviously, China is much more packed. Some of the major cities that you might have heard of that are in China: Beijing, which is the capital of China, Shanghai, Hong Kong. There's many major cities in China, but those are 3 of the world's largest cities that are all found in China. Something that I think is very interesting, and it is going to be important for our notes today, is ethnic groups, right? So a lot of people will think that, well, everybody in China is Chinese. And that's an oversimplification of things. China is a very diverse country. It's kind of like assuming that everybody in the United States is American, which makes sense, right? Everybody in the US is American. But not everyone in the United States identifies as just American. There's more specific ethnic groups that we tend to put ourselves into, right? Because you could be Irish American, Italian American, African American, Mexican American. There's all sorts of different ethnic groups that people put themselves into. And the same thing happens in China. And by far the largest ethnic group in China, with almost well, actually, I think it's over 1 billion members, is a group known as the Han. The Han, H-A-N, Han Chinese, are the most prominent ethnic group in China, and they were around in the Ming Dynasty. Well, they were the people who created the Ming Dynasty back during the medieval period, and we'll get more into that in a second. Right, so that's just some basic information, and I don't want to go without mentioning that China is the 2nd wealthiest country in the world. Now, there's a lot of different ways to measure wealth, but basically, if you take the economy and add everything up, it's the 2nd richest country in the world. You probably know what the 1st richest country in the world is. That would be the United States. And some people argue that technically, since the United States owes China trillions and trillions of dollars, that really China is the wealthiest country in the world. All China would have to do is force the United States to pay back their debt, and China would be the wealthiest. But that's not really the way the world works. But for you to kind of understand, when you think about the items, the things you have in your house, how many of them are made in China? Right? When you think about it, there's a lot of things made in China. It's a very common thing to see. But so when you realize that, you realize that in order for that to be made in China and end up here in the United States, somebody had to pay for it. And when you realize how much of our everyday items are made in China, that's when you can see just how much wealth the Chinese have obviously accrued by being the producers of so many things, from technology to furniture to everyday toys and stuff like that. The Chinese economy is massive, which is why you'll hear the United States politics and news and all that always focus on China, because it's our main rival as far as economic power goes. So it is an important nation. It wasn't always as important as it is today, but in the medieval period is basically when it became this very important nation that the rest of the world had to contend with, right? So how does this come about? Well, first of all, we're going to focus on the Ming Dynasty. Now, I'm assuming that you guys talked about China in 6th grade. It should have been ancient China. And you might have heard of the mandate of heaven and the concept of dynasties. So what ends up happening is that a ruling family, right? Usually they have a ruler known as the emperor. And when the emperor dies, he'll pass it on to his grandchild or a daughter or nephew, something like that. It stays within the family. And as that lineage goes down, this is known as a dynasty. But sometimes that family will be taken out of power, or a new ruling family will come in, and that will create a new dynasty. And the Chinese always gave each one of their dynasties a unique name. That is like, so if we say the Yuan dynasty or the Ming dynasty, that's not like their last name. Those words mean something in Chinese. So usually it means something interesting, like it might mean the Red Dynasty or the Fierce Dynasty. The Ming Dynasty meant the Rainbow Dynasty, because it was basically after a storm. I don't know if you guys have ever noticed when rainbows come out, it's usually after a storm. And so that's the way the Ming kind of pictured themselves in Chinese history, because they are the people who rose up in a rebellion against the Mongols, right? So we had just finished talking about how the Mongols conquered this massive empire, taking basically all of Asia for themselves. And the grandson of Genghis Khan, Kublai Khan, settled into China. He became a huge fan of China and built these amazing palaces. And we talked about how Marco Polo went to China. But you have to remember, Kublai Khan was not Chinese. He was a Mongol. So even though he was ruling over China and had his palaces in China and learned the Chinese ways and practiced Buddhism and all these things, the Chinese did not see him as one of their own. In fact, the Han, who was what they called themselves, it's the ethnic group, they really resented the fact that they were ruled over a foreigner, an outsider. And generally, when you're an outsider, people don't take kindly to you ruling over them. So the Mongols also were not the greatest administrators of government. So they might have been great conquerors, but it wasn't going that great in China for the Mongols. And eventually the Han organized themselves, formed an army, and kicked out the Mongols, who were really not as strong as they were under Genghis and Kublai Khan anymore. So the Han are able to take over, and their leader, a man named Hong Wu, which will be on your quiz, make sure you have that, Hong Wu becomes the first emperor and starts this new dynasty of China being ruled by the Chinese, in this case, the ethnic Han. Right? And from this moment onward, it is known as the Ming Dynasty, and they're going to rule for about 300 years. And we're going to focus on mainly them. After the Ming, it is a different group that comes in and invades, and we'll talk about them just slightly at the end, right? Now, the important accomplishments of the Ming Dynasty, they did a lot of things that kind of put China on the map, right? So the Mongols actually did China a big favor, because before Genghis Khan came in and invaded China, China was split into three different kingdoms. And by conquering all three of those kingdoms and ruling over them as one, it kind of created the modern state of China, which is this one massive group. And it almost looks kind of like how China looks like on the map now. So when the Ming take over, they take over this big group of China that the Mongols had created. All three of those empires came right into the Ming, but they also went and expanded it outward. They took over places. They were was always at war with Korea. We'll talk more about Korea, how they always refused to get conquered all the time, and they conquered a whole lot of extra area. But they also became big time manufacturers, right? And if you don't know what manufacturing means, it means that you create products, right? So if I have a factory where I build computers all day, then I manufacture computers. If I build desks all day, then I manufacture desks. Point is, you're making things that eventually get sold. And China was known for producing silk, right? That's why the Silk Road, a road that led from China to Europe, was called that, because Europeans did not know how to make silk. It was a big secret, right? They had no clue. They didn't know that it came from the silkworm and all these other things. So China became very popular for its silk, and if you wore silk, it was a sign of wealth. It still is today, actually. One of the other things that China became really well known for is porcelain. Now, a lot of you guys may have like porcelain dishes or porcelain dolls or things like that. And porcelain was another one of these big secrets that only the Chinese knew how to manufacture it, how to make it. And it was very fancy, it was shiny and smooth, and people all over the world wanted this porcelain that the Chinese made. In fact, it was so well known to be from China that they called it China instead of porcelain. So whenever the royal families in Europe wanted to have fancy dinners, they would take out the china, which meant they had these porcelain Chinese dishes that came all the way from China, right? And this, when you sell things that the whole world wants, this makes you a lot of money. Other things that the Ming were very well known for is they built a brand new capital city of Beijing, which is still to this day the capital of China. And then they built an entire city where the emperor and his wives would all live. Yes, I said wives because the Ming emperor would usually have somewhere around 100 to 200 wives for himself, and they would all live in the Forbidden City with him. Why was it called the Forbidden City? Because nobody was allowed to go into that city except for the emperor and his family. And if a government server had to come in, like somebody who works for the emperor, and he was a male, then he had to make a pretty large sacrifice in order to be allowed into the Forbidden City. Basically, they would turn him into a eunuch, Y-U-N-I-C. Wait, is it Y-U? No, sorry, U-N-I-C. And if you don't know what a eunuch is, you could Google it. If you're a guy, you can see why this is a major sacrifice that you would have to make to be allowed into the Forbidden City. But it was the only way you would be allowed in, because the emperor did not take kindly to random people coming into the Forbidden City. But it's a very famous place. We discovered it, I think maybe about 100 years ago. One of the Ming emperors had himself buried with like hundreds and hundreds of all his servants as statues and stuff. There will be a video on the Forbidden City and how amazing a place it was. It was built by the Ming. They also rebuilt or fortified a lot of important things, such as the Great Wall. Pretty sure you guys are all familiar with the Great Wall of China. It was originally built a couple of 100 years before the Ming, but it was never completed, and it wasn't really that great of a wall until the Ming decided to finish it up, right? It had some holes in it, right? To patch up all the holes and to fortify it. They built watchtowers and all these other things along the Great Wall. So the Ming are really the ones who made, before that, I guess it was just a wall, and then the Ming made it the Great Wall. And another one of the great things that they did is the Grand Canal. They took the two major rivers in China, the Yangtze and the Yellow River, and they connected them with a canal. It's kind of like connecting the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River, right? This was a big deal because it allowed transportation and the flow of people and ideas. It united China because before it was kind of split between the two different river valleys. Remember, rivers back in these days were kind of like the highways of today, right? This is before cars and before modern highways. The fastest way to travel would be on a river. So if you could build a canal across your entire country, that was like creating a highway. All of these are the things that were established by the Ming. All right. Now, probably the most important person from the Ming Dynasty that I want you guys to be aware of is this guy. It looks like it should be pronounced Zhang He, but it's actually pronounced Zheng He. I'll say that again, Zheng He. And I'm sure you guys have heard of some explorers like Christopher Columbus, or maybe you've heard of Henry Hudson or Vasco da Gama. But Zheng He is really the first major explorer. Under the Ming Dynasty, they built him a massive fleet. We're talking about hundreds and hundreds of sailors and boats that they gave him, and his mission was to explore the oceans, which in China that basically meant the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, to go and visit lands from far, far away and introduce them to the great Ming Dynasty so they could establish trade. And Christopher Columbus is famous for discovering America for the Europeans. He left with 3 boats. Zheng He had fleets of at least 30 ships, right? Accounts are different depending on which one of his many voyages it was, but he had about 30,000 people that sailed with him, and his ships were about the size of like a football stadium. So this was a big deal, and he is credited to have found Southeast Asian kingdoms, Indian kingdoms, African kingdoms, and established trading relationships with them on behalf of the Ming Chinese emperor. So, and we know about this because it's documented in African places, in Indian places, in Southeast Asian places. They document this great explorer who got there. Unfortunately, while Zheng He was still alive, the Ming emperor died, and his son decided that it wasn't that important to continue exploring. And he basically had Zheng He come back to China, and they burnt all of the ships. Why they burned all of his ships, we have no idea. It is one of the great mysteries in history. But a lot of people wonder, what if Zheng He would have been allowed to continue sailing the oceans? It's an interesting thought, because it would have been inevitable for Zheng He to have eventually landed in North America or South America. And instead of talking about Europeans being the first ones to interact with the Native Americans, it might have been the Chinese, right? So just imagine how different history would have been. But the main reason why we believe, because we don't actually know, that the Ming decided to stop sailing and focus more on being at home is because guess who started showing up again? The Mongols. And this was the time period where they decided, you know what, we need to fortify the Great Wall. We need all of our resources and manpower to focus on the Great Wall. So they kind of scrapped the whole idea of China as a naval power, and they focused on fortifying their Great Wall and building up a large army so they could defend themselves against the Mongols, because the last thing they wanted was to have to be invaded once again by the Mongols. So you're going to watch a video about some of these great feats that the Ming were able to establish. And unfortunately for them, even though, I mean, the amount of work they put into building the Great Wall is ridiculous, right? I don't know if any of you guys have ever traveled to China and seen the Great Wall, but it is one of the largest man-made buildings that exists in the world, and they built it back in the medieval time period. And it was kind of interesting the way they built it. They used rice, a combination of rice and lime, that kind of created a sort of like cement paste, and that's what it was built out of. But unfortunately for the Chinese, it didn't work. They didn't get invaded by the Mongols, but they would eventually get invaded by Mongols 2.0, which is a group of people known as the Manchu, who were able to scale around or over the Great Wall, and they would take over China, and they would end up overthrowing the Ming Dynasty and creating their own dynasty. But we're gonna leave it at this part right here. in the Mongol history, right? So hopefully you took down all of these notes, and we'll continue again on Wednesday with a little bit more information. This will be all the notes on the Ming Dynasty, and I'm going to attach a Google Forms assignment along with this video, where you're going to watch a video on Zheng He and a video on the Forbidden City, and you're just going to answer the multiple choice questions and turn it in. I'll either have it posted today, Monday, or maybe for tomorrow on Tuesday. And if you have any questions or comments, remember, we will be having a live chat tomorrow at 10:30, or you could always write me an email or write me a class comment. So there you go. Ming Dynasty. See you guys later.